Welcome everybody to AI TV. We're broadcasting live from AI Expo Africa 2020, the online COVID edition. We're all virtual this year, including AI TV. We've had to take our studio online into the cloud, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Archana Arakkal, who's the lead machine learning engineer at Synthesis Software. And one of the big topics that's been consistent through the show has been looking at responsible deployment of machine learning AI solutions, and also things like ethics that we should also be considering in a business context. So Archana, you expressed quite a keen interest in this area. I mean, what should we as practitioners and the business community be thinking about when we hear this phrase, responsible deployment? What does that actually mean in layman's real world terms?
Okay, firstly, thanks for having me on the show, Nick. It's always a great opportunity to be part of these interviews. So from my perspective, being a practitioner in this space and actually having to get AI solutions into production, it becomes quite key to first identify whether AI is actually needed. So actually first starting off, AI is a buzzword, and everyone wants to get their hands on AI and utilizing it in their systems. But what people tend to forget about is bringing AI into a production system also brings its own level of complexity. So it becomes key to truly identify whether it is necessary to utilize AI in your system. And if it isn't, there's alternatives. You don't have to go down the AI approach. I think it becomes more important to cater for when AI is needed rather than using AI when it's the best buzzword at that moment. So I think that's the first starting point, I would say, to use it for when it's needed.
Okay, so let's assume then we've established that it's needed and there's a use case that can readily and usefully use machine learning. I mean, in the context of some of the other things that we need to now think about. I mean, I've come from a background, for example, on precision, accuracy, and bias. Three completely different terms which are often confused and conflated, and people mix them up, but they're actually very important aspects of understanding how accurate or how effective the end solution is going to be. In terms of its predictive, if it's predicting something or recommending something, you want to know those factors as well as all the other ethical considerations. So do you have some recommendations then? So once you've established the use case and the need, what do you walk customers through a kind of assessment, or how do you? What are the next categories of things then that people should be looking at?
Yeah, and it's actually a very valid point that you brought now, because once you have established that AI is indeed needed, then it's about understanding whether your organization or your business is ready for AI, because now you need to actually get into the detail of understanding the maturity of your environment, understanding the maturity of your data. And this is where what you refer to with regards to biasing and precision comes into play, right? Because if your data isn't good enough, if your data isn't actually on a particular standard, then that's your first problem. That's the first thing you need to address. Then once that has actually been established, then it's about understanding, okay, what can we actually find in the data that we can utilize for our system? And if we can utilize this for our system, is this actually sustainable in our current infrastructure? If not, do we need to pivot our infrastructure to make it more sustainable? Would we need to adopt new technology? So there is, generally speaking, it would be best to, once you have established a good use case, walk through a maturity assessment or some kind of way of understanding whether your infrastructure and whether your business is in fact ready for AI. Because it's not something you can easily put together. It's actually an organizational change that needs to be addressed. So that maturity element is important to understand. And once you have done that, then it becomes easier, because now you have a clear roadmap to get it to where it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, the maturity planning is that's actually my background in terms of helping large customers. This is sort of in a pre-machine learning world where we're just looking at deploying just systems and software technology development solutions, maturity planning. It's so great to hear someone using that phrase. What you're actually doing in your business is building a competency and a capability, and that competency and capability is made up of multiple things like people, processes, strategy, organization, training, and technology. And often people are thinking, hey, we're just deploying technology. Well, you're not. You're actually deploying a capability, and that is made up of a selection of other components, which probably, and often I've said this fairly controversially, in my opinion, technology is the least important part of that equation. All the other components are, well, as important, if not more important, than the technology to get right. Because if you don't get them right, then the technology will never be right. The deployment, the competency, the capability will never be right. Do you actually have a framework that I don't think there is any international maturity framework for AI yet. But have you devised your own in-house ones, or what's your commentary on sort of standards and planning around maturity frameworks? Are there any that you'd recommend? Because I don't think any exist just yet.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a bunch of frameworks that exist on different, if you look at different institutes, there are frameworks that exist, but for me personally, what I found more valuable is to actually devise my own based off experience.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to actually understanding what sort of realm you work in, right? Because financial sector and the healthcare sector and the mining sector are different. There are common similarities between them, but each niche has their own things you need to cater for, right? So it comes with experience. And so I have actually put together a framework that I use personally, just so I don't miss out any valuable information. But it comes with experience, and it becomes really important to, if you are trying to change an organization, if you're trying to, like, especially a large corporate organization, into getting into sort of way of thinking, it's important to have people like that can understand where the blind spots could potentially be. So it's important to cater for that and do enough research. Like you mentioned, it's not just a technology that you're moving forward, it's an organization, and there's people, processes, protocols. There's so many different elements that are moving around. So having these sort of frameworks help me personally. So what I would, to give you a little bit of insight as to what sort of elements I look at, it's actually technology on its own is literally only 20% of what I look at from a maturity perspective. The biggest portion comes, 20%. And then like the biggest portion comes from people. Are the people actually ready? Is leadership actually ready? Is the right principles in place? Do they have the correct organizational structures to cater for these sort of moving parts? Then comes technology, where you would need to say, okay, do we have deployment processes in place? Do we have data engineering pipelines in place? But a lot of it is around the people element of the organization.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's great, Archana, that you're considering that. I mean, there's obviously much larger generalistic kinds of frameworks like COBIT, ITIL, CMMI, to name but a few. I know there's some, I think the IEEE and ISO are also working on some AI specific standards. And when I spoke to Fred Werner at the ITU, he still said, we're at this very formative stage where, an international single standard, doesn't exist just yet. But it's great that companies, like Synthesis and like yourself are helping customers navigate through this. It's a very complicated world, but equally, people rushing to this bright light of the fourth industrial revolution and AI. I think if they're not considering these things, as you say, like a checklist, then you can quickly get into trouble. Yeah, we did a survey, and we asked a whole load of businesses about what they're buying, what they're actually deploying. And we actually specifically asked them around their maturity. And one of the areas where they felt they were weak was in skills and knowledge to deploy these systems, which I think is probably, very specific to the South African community that we surveyed. But the other question that we asked them was around ethics. And the question was, are you developing your own ethical framework, or are you getting other people in to help you do that. And it was almost like a 50-50 split. Half the companies were doing their own ethical framework, and the other half were getting company in to do that. So is that something you're also being asked, Archana, to get involved in, sort of building an ethical framework, or do you have something off the shelf that you can give them?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, we don't have anything off the shelf that we utilize because it's a new realm, and it's unfortunately we're all still trying to figure it out. I don't think anyone actually has the answers. I mean, there have been a couple of AI manifestos that I've had a look at. There's a couple. I mean, IEEE has released something as well, which I thought was great, but I don't think we've actually solved that ethical problem too holistically at the moment. So we've had to engage in these ethical discussions. We've had to try and create these policies previously, but it's all very much based on a use case. It's very much based on like, for example, if we have a consumer behavior application that we need to develop, then it's around the ethics around those aspects. What can we actually bring into the table so that we don't actually keep the human being out of it, or anything like that. That's essentially when I've had to engage, but there isn't really a formal manifesto of sorts that we would actually bring to the table. At the moment, we've got like an aggregated set, which is like a combination of multiple manifestos that we've gathered over time, but nothing concrete at the moment. And I believe a lot of companies do need to engage in that exercise.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we're moving into this kind of the privacy, surveillance, ethical, I won't call it a minefield, but companies now have to tread very, very carefully with data sovereignty, privacy, obviously security, that's a given. But it's a much more rigorous discussion that's required, I think, when you come to the ethical aspects of it. Particularly if you're, let's say you're building a system that's going to recommend funeral cover or life cover, for example, and you exclude a certain person because there's an error in your discriminator or whatever model that you've built, then ethically you could say, well, you're automatically screening people out that actually have a right to purchase that product. Because there's an error or a bias in your system, you're actually discriminating them. And do you know what that bias is? Can you quantify that? I was working with an American platform which was broadly using machine learning to automate and understand email from a sales perspective. And then their back-end model allowed you to, through a dashboard, to understand the absolute error of the assessment. So if the score was low, then you could send back corrective information through the dashboard. So the solution would be trained by hand, essentially, based on that feedback. So I think, if you and that technology been around for about 10 years and it has evolved to that point. I suspect many off-the-shelf hand-built solutions right now are going to be lacking that kind of feedback loop. So do you see the person in the loop feedback as being an essential part of the solution now in business?
Yeah, definitely, and that's actually something I encourage on most of the solutions that I engage on. Is you have to include humans as part of the solution. AI is here to help you and is here to assist you, but it's not here to take over your job. It's not here, and it's not by any way near perfect. It requires a lot of feedback. It requires a lot of quantifying whether it is actually true or not. It's nowhere near perfect, and the only way to get it to a state where it can actually be useful to beings is by including humans as part of the process. Getting human beings to train your models to ensure that it is accurate to a great degree. So I think humans are definitely very, very vital for this, especially now, especially since we're still in the beginning phases of AI and getting technology out there. Humans are now more than before more important to the solution.
Well, Archana, I mean, we could talk about this all afternoon, essentially. But I want to say thank you for coming on AI TV. If anybody's interested in carrying on the debate with Archana, I'll leave her LinkedIn profile in the information below on this video. and you can get in contact and have that discussion with her. But I think these softer elements of deploying technology now are fast becoming perhaps the most important success criteria that businesses need to think about. And it's been great to talk to you about that today, Archana. And thanks for making a contribution to the event and coming on AI TV today.
Thank you for having me, Nick. This was a great discussion.